to introduce you to Luis, who many of you already know. Luis makes me very old, so I'm not going to talk about that. But I know Luis since 1996,
or something like that.
Something like that. We first met at Brown University at a conference, and then he went to the to study, and I went there to teach. And since then, we are kind of together. But, well, Luis specializes in Spanish and Latin American literature, transatlantic studies, and Spanish film. He received a master in Spanish by Yale University in 2002, year that he came to the University of Michigan to study Spanish. He received his PhD from Romance Languages in 2005. Currently, he is Associate Professor of Peninsular and Latin American Literature and Culture at the University of California, San Diego. His research interests include Marxism, psychoanalysis, transatlantic studies, Spanish film, critical pedagogy, and cultural theory. He has published extensively on Latin American and Spanish cultures and on political thought. Luis is the director of an amazing project that I encourage you to go to see in the web, called the Spanish Civil War Memory Project, a University of California San Diego initiative to collect testimonies of survivors from the Spanish Civil War. He can give you the link, or you can go to UC San Diego for the link. He's also the cultural editor of a very prestigious Spanish newspaper, and a very good one, called Rebellion, and a frequent collaborator of other alternative newspapers. His book, Radical Justice, Spain and the Southern Cone, Beyond Market and State, published by Bucknell University Press, is an analysis of dictatorial regimes on both sides of the Atlantic, specifically Argentina, Chile, and Spain, that uses detective fiction and political documentaries as a privileged terrain to interrogate the relationship between memory and justice in these regions. I also encourage you to read this book. It's a really good one. Luis is an academic activist and a prolific administrator. A prolific administrator in University California, San Diego. Acting chair of Global South Studies section, Spanish section head in his department, and an affiliate faculty of the Center for Iberian and Latin American Studies and of Ethnic Studies. Since leaving Michigan, Luis has become an important, well-respected, and very visible voice in Hispanic studies. For all these accomplishments, our department is very proud. The talk today, entitled Against the Idolatry of Economic Growth, Elements for a Cultural Critique of Environmental Destruction, is part of the Rackham, the Rackham Graduate School Centennial Alumni lecturers, and forms part of his current project, which working title is The Residual Force of Marxism. And I imagine that he's going to talk about it. So please join me in welcoming back Luis Martin-Cabrera in our department.
Well, thank you so much for coming so late. I know it's late, so when I have like 5 minutes, well, actually, okay. Because it's late and you're probably already tired, I'm gonna start with 2 stories to entertain you, and you can fall asleep later on. So when I came to Michigan, like the first or second or third Saturday, I was like walking around in the Arboretum, and I started to hear people like yelling like, ah, and I didn't know what was going on, and of course, there was a Michigan football game, you know. And as a good leftist intellectual, I despise it right away as a populist entertainment, you know, the Ann Arbor version of the opium of the people. And then Frank Casa gave me 2 tickets, you know, and I went with Carlos to see a game, you know, of the Michigan Wolverines, or as our students call them in the blue book los ventiladores de los lobeznos, the Wolverines fans. And I became a fan, and then I went later on with Cristina as well, And I'm telling you all of this because the best way I have to describe how I feel in like being here and talking to all of you is by saying that it feels like homecoming. Not because I feel that I'm as important as the Michigan football team, I'm not that narcissistic, but really because, Michigan will always feel like home to me, I think many of you here know that I spent probably some of the worst and the best times of my life. I was, really depressed at some point. And I kind of reinvented myself here, and it is thanks to all of you, but of course the first person I have to recognize is Cristina, because she saved me from that, I believe, whose name I don't want to pronounce or remember because I believe that even when I say the name, I'm making publicity for them. So you already said it, but like truly, no, I really want to say that without Cristina, I would probably be organizing janitors in LA, which would be fun. Would be very fine, but if I'm able to speak at all, it's because she was an example, of dignity, of intellectual integrity, and she really rescued me from a very, very bad situation. That's why we will always, stick together for good or for bad, I don't know. And then, of course, Gareth, Gareth had the great idea to coming out of a depression to make me read the Grundrisse by Marx. So that's, for those of you who don't know, 600 pages of really in-depth, Marxist thought. And I have to say that is better than Tranquimacin or any of the antidepressants in the market. And of course, there are so many people that I could just list your names and the names of those who are not here, like Alberto. I have to just at least think about Alberto and Daniel. And precisely because I love you so much, I'm sorry for the cheesy moment, I just couldn't come back and give you a refrito, right? Like something that I already have written or that I have thought. So I really wanted to present something that I'm really working on right now. So it is a work in progress. And I know people say it's a work in progress so that when you ask me a really hard question, I'm like, of course, I just need to think more about that. I'm telling you that it's a work in progress so that you see that I am really vulnerable, that my arguments have a lot of flaws, and that I'm expecting you to attack me, and that I will respond in kind in the best Michigan tradition to your attacks, comments, agreements, or disagreements. So how did I come to sort of think about this new project? I am in a department that is not Romance languages or Spanish and Portuguese, anything like that. It is a literature department where we're all together. History of religion, comparative literature, Spanish, French, everybody is together. And it was very interesting because when I taught a class on the politics of memory, I realized that my classes on the politics of memory were on the politics of memory in Spain or in Argentina or both. And when my colleagues in American Studies taught a class on the politics of memory, they just taught a class on the politics of memory in general. But all the examples, it was like a universal claim, but all the examples happened to be from the United States or from books that are written in English. So I thought, okay, well, I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to write a book that is going to be about theory in general, and my examples are going to happen to be all from Latin America and Spain, just because. That's why, I know you all hate the title, Marcelino already told me. But that's why I refuse, and we can discuss about this, I just want you to see what's behind what I'm doing. That's why I refuse to write Spain or Southern Cone or Argentina or anything like that, because I think they need to hear us out, and if we don't intervene in that way, I think they will always place us into a region, and what we say or what we do matters for that region. So it's an attempt to provincialize the United States, not only Europe, as who is who said that? Chakrabarti, thank you. So I think we need to provincialize U.S. American cultural studies because that goes on an everyday basis with me. And then I thought, okay, so I'm very interested in Marxism, and I've been having this sort of dual conversation. I've been having this conversation with the people, and I'm going to oversimplify the positions. But the everyday conversations that we have within Rebellion, the newspaper that Cristina was talking about, these people understand, they have a very complex, nuanced critique of capitalism, but it's harder for them to see gender issues or race issues or other kinds of issues. And then, of course, I'm an affiliated of ethnic studies, critical gender studies, and these people understand those issues really well, but sometimes, you read it and you're like, yeah, but this is really I mean, I don't understand. It's very ambiguous. I don't understand if you're really formulating a critique of capitalism. If you think that there is a name like Hola Verdesio, ¿qué tal? If you think that, you know, that there is a solution to these problems within capitalism. So I've been having this sort of like, both explanations are sort of like not enough, you know, in a way. So I decided to go back to like Marxism to see, this is why the residual force of Marxism, of course, is referring to like Raymond Williams' famous distinction between residual and emergent, right? And it is residual, not in any negative sense, because it is still a force, but it's not enough. So I'm interested in seeing the places where Marxism is necessary, but not enough. You know, it needs to be complemented or supplemented with something else. What are those terrains, right? And that's what I'm interested in seeing. And in this particular case, it has to do with the environment, right? Like ecology and the environment is something that have made traditionally Marxism very uncomfortable. We've said some things, but you know, like it's one of these critical terrains where you can see like some of these limits. And the real origin of all of this is like back in the day. This is the second story, and then I'll say something else. I went to the Monterey Bay, and if you go now, have you read on Cannery Road, Steinbeck, and like all the cannery industries and all that? Well, right now there is no cannery industry there. There is sort of like a theme park. You go there, you walk around, and they show you where the cannery was, where like Steinbeck was staying, all of that. And then you turn a corner, and there is a little plate kind of hidden, and it says, there used to be all of these banks of sardines, and now, you know, the Monterey Bay is depleted of sardines. And this is kind of like a footnote in the theme park. And I'm like, well, how could it be? You know, like it's depleted and nobody does anything about this? I mean, we've depleted like these banks, and within, I think, a matter of like 10 or like 11 years, these things are depleted, and apparently we accept it as natural or something like that. And then, you know, like I get in touch with Ecologistas Nación in Madrid. And I should say that a lot of what I have to say comes from my compañera and camarada Yayo Herrero, and it feels many times that it's a repetition, so I want to bring her up here already. So if I have to, you know, to summarize, if I couldn't say anything else but this quote, I would say this. Anyone who believes that exponential growth can go on forever in a finite world is either a madman or an economist. You know, I think you'll see why. That I want this to frame what I'm saying, because this is part of the problem, that we act as if the planet doesn't have any limits, but it does. So then I went to see what our people in literature do under the name or rubric of eco-criticism. I don't know if you heard about this. What is eco-criticism? And I read some of the definitions and all that, and it's very disconcerting and limited, you know, like, so I'm not going to read the entire definition. But some of the questions they ask is like, how is nature represented in this sonnet? Are the values expressed in this play consistent with ecological wisdom? You know, it lacks, you know, I won't read the entire thing, but it lacks a real materialist critique, you know, of the limits of the planet. It's very dissatisfied, in my opinion, and I'll explain why. You know, most of it, like PMLA had a number of sustainable development, which I think is an oxymoron. And they like most of the people writing of eco-criticism actually come out of like English departments from the West Coast. You know, they really love, it's the ecology of the rich, to put it like in short. And a lot of it has to do with consumer activism, and like they have a vague critique of sustainable development. If you go around in any university in the United States, you'll see the buses are sustainable, the chair is sustainable, the batteries, you know, like, it's also very smart and like sustainable. Everything is sustainable, but yet, you know, we continue to predicate the belief in economic growth. And a lot of times, even like eco-criticism becomes some kind of like, because we cannot make a revolution, at least we can change our consumer behavior. So like here is another quote from somebody saying, in place of a workers' revolution, social ecologists promote exemplary lifestyles and communities that prefigure a more general social transformation and give people practice in sustainable living and participatory democracy. So, if I drive my Prius and recycle, I'm fine. You know, more or less that's what they come to say. I might be being harsh, but I really believe that, and we can debate it. So, that's the moment when I'm like, okay, we should go, you know, back to Marx and see what can we learn, you know, for a more materialist critique of the environment and like environmental disasters. And I went back to Marx, And I went to the Marx of the so-called young Marx of the economic and philosophical manuscripts, and the Marx of the Critic of the Gotha program. So if I ask you right now, what do you think is according to Marx, the source of all wealth? How is wealth created? You probably would say labor, right? But if you read carefully the Critic of the Gotha program, you find this. Labor is not the source of all wealth. Nature is just as much the source of use values as labor, which is itself only the expression of a natural power, human labor power, right? So Marx knew that you couldn't create nothing without nature, that labor is not the only thing. And in fact, in the same Critic of the Gotha program, he said that it's the bourgeois ideology who persuade people that labor is the only source of all, I won't read the next one, is the only source of wealth because they take nature for granted. And because actually, the transit from feudalism to the Industrial Revolution is a process in which land became a commodity. It was commodified, and human beings were alienated both from each other and from nature. That is exactly what happened, and that is what covers this ideology that you find in Ricardo, Adam Smith, and so on and so forth. So for Marx, it was especially the young Marx, but I think you can find it later, that commodification of land and nature that, by the way, you can find also in a lot of indigenous epistemologies. When you say nature is the Pachamama, you're saying it's not a commodity. If it's your mother, it cannot be a commodity that can be traded. So that's a point of sort of like agreement between Marxism and indigenous epistemologies. So for Marx, it was clear that there was this double process of alienation, and that is exactly what for him was communism, like coming out of this double alienation of like nature, he said he uses a very heteronormative language, there's no way around it, but between human beings and nature. So I read this quote. This communism as fully developed naturalism equals humanism, and is fully developed humanism equals naturalism. It is the genuine resolution of the conflict between man and nature and between man and man. The true resolution of the strife between existence and essence, between objectification and self-confirmation, between freedom and necessity, between the individual and a species. Communism is the riddle of history solved, and it notes itself to be this solution. End of quote. This is the moment where, like, we used to run away from the young Marx and say, oh my God, humanism, like I cannot, this is very bad, it's another universalism, I can really agree with this. But I think we need to understand this in a slightly different manner. We don't have to understand this humanism as a human essence. I think Marx is following here closely the Aristotelian distinction between potentiality. Your potentiality is trapped because nature is commodified and you are alienated from the other human beings, and not as ontological actuality, as intellectia, energy of substance. This and the way he describes this is like, man has this life living energy, vital energy that enters into friction with what he calls the sensuous external world, and that is what creates wealth and what is trapped in this double process of commodification. So I still think this is very important, that if you depart from this double commodification of land and the alienation of human beings from each other, you have a first step in what I would call the right direction, and that in spite of the Hegelian resonances of the previous quote, this conception of communism still retains the residual force necessary for a real transformative ecology in times of danger. Sorry, it's really hard. But okay, so far you can get all of that from Marx. But what it is that you cannot get from Marx, and what are the limits? And the limits have to do with two things: reproductive labor, female reproductive labor, and what the social ecologists call externalities. Joan Martinez Alier, I cannot recommend enough, if you're interested in this, to read Joan Martinez Alier's work. He's the one who coined the term the ecology of the poor to distinguish between the Sierra Club and what happens when peasants in Bolivia organize together to stop the Tigris road from happening in the middle of the territory. So Martinez-Alier distinguishes between what he called externalities. And what happens is that traditional economy doesn't, the only thing that traditional economy, and by that I mean the neoclassicals, takes into account is the cost of labor, land, and the reproduction of capital, right? So and Marx does the same thing, that the only thing that counts is labor within the factory walls, right, and nature. Those are the two things. But what happened with the externalities? And externalities are things like, they are synchronic and diachronic. So by diachronic, I mean that the neoclassical economy doesn't take into account what happened to future generations. If we overfish, sardines in the Monterey Bay, like the economy, the traditional economy, and Marx with it cannot valorize, cannot calculate, the damage that is going to take place if we deplete, sardines ban, or if we take all the oil that is under the land, or if we do gas fracking. It doesn't take into account what happens to future generations, and it also doesn't take into account what is happening right now in our present moment. That's why if you follow like the dispute between Chevron in Ecuador, the argument of Chevron is all the time, well, but that's, this is an accident. So it shouldn't be included in the mechanisms of like valorization. So it doesn't, it considers damage, ecological damage in the present, and ecological damage for future generations, an externality, something that is external to the workings of the economy. There are some interesting attempts, to valorize these kinds of things, like the Yasuni initiative in Ecuador is very interesting. They just managed to get international organizations to pay them for not extracting the oil, to say like, how much money would it cost if you don't do it, you respect the land, and they did it, and it's a very interesting example. But in general, this type of like damage is not accounted for in neither in Marxism nor in like neoclassical economy. And the other thing is, so I'm just gonna go forward because I see the time is happening, but it has to do with the difference between price and value, right? The market has a mechanism of prices, but it doesn't value things like what are we leaving for future generations. And there is a quote from Martinez-Alier, I won't read it all, but the last part is, en un contexto ecológico, el verso de Antonio Machado, todo necio confunde valor y precio, es muy oportuno. So value, like keeping our resources for the future, is not price, doesn't have anything to do with the mechanism of price. And the other thing that Marxism doesn't take into account is what Yayo Herrero and the ecofeminists call los trabajos del cuidado, the labor of care. And I'll read the quote and you will understand what I mean by that. Los trabajos de las mujeres, and here is the quote for those of you who, it's a very bad translation, I apologize. Los trabajos de las mujeres, a pesar de considerarse separados del entorno productivo, producen una mercancía fundamental para el sistema económico, la fuerza de trabajo. Denominaremos trabajo de cuidados a las tareas asociadas a la reproducción humana, la crianza, la resolución de las necesidades básicas, la promoción de la salud, el apoyo emocional, la facilitación de la participación social. Esta colección difusa de trabajos incluye asuntos tan dispares como cocinar 3 veces al día, 7 días en semana, 12 meses al año, cuidar a las personas enfermas, hacer camas, vigilar constantemente los primeros pasos de un bebé, decidir qué comen las personas de la casa, etc. So, like when a worker comes to a factory, he has eaten, somebody has taken care of him when he was a child, like all of this labor of care that is supposed to be natural for women is unpaid and unrecognized, but is part of our society. It would be impossible. The example that I always put to my students is like, what do you think would happen if your mom and your grandma decided to strike for an entire week and not cook, not take care of the children? You think we could work as a society? I mean, how do you, when you come, like who has done all of these things at home that are taken for granted but just contribute to the wealth of a society? So neither reproductive labor nor externalities are taken into account in either Marxism or the classic economy. And this is what I think is very interesting, like if you take Marxism, ecofeminism, and the social ecology, all of these 3 bodies of knowledge come together in what is called in Europe degrowth, the crecimiento, the degrowth movement. And in the South, it's not exactly the same thing, it's called buen vivir, right? Like the indigenous, and by buen vivir is very interesting. A lot of like the indigenous in Bolivia or Ecuador, they call buen vivir to distinguish from vivir mejor. They said that Western societies are obsessed with having a bigger screen, living better. And the point is to live good within the means of the material sphere of society. So the growth, one of the first things that the crecimiento does is to criticize the obsession with, that's the title, the obsession with growth. If you open the pages of any newspaper or the TV, both in Spain or in France or in the United States, you will hear politicians on the right and on the left talking about the need to grow. We need to keep growing. Exponential growth, is fundamental. Without that, there is nothing. It's like a little idol that requires sacrifices, both in terms, of prosperity and especially in times of scarcity, right? And you hear from like union leaders, social democrats, liberals, conservatives, they debate the terms of what is best to promote growing, and they might disagree on what to do with the wealth that is created with growing, but nobody questions the need to grow. It's just, without doubt, there is nothing. And so the grow kind of take the opposite position, and basically the argument is that in a limited planet, the oil, once you burn oil or you exhaust, a given resource, that resource is not coming back. So you have a limited planet, you have limited resources, but yet you believe in endless exponential growth. And so to give you a quote from Serge Latouche, who is the person who sort of has popularized the concept of degrowth, but is not the only one. Other people like Martin-Cabrera in Spain have also contributed to that. One of the things that he said, and I quote, is that to make perfectly clear that we must abandon the goal of exponential growth, as that goal is promoted by nothing other than the quest for profits on the part of the owners of capital and has disastrous implications for the environment and therefore for humanity. It is not that society is reduced to being nothing more than an instrument or a means to be used by the productive mechanism. Human beings themselves are becoming the waste products of a system that would like to make them useless and do without them. Of course, it's not a matter of degrowing for the sake of degrowing. It has to be, number one, a collective project. I usually get this question like, okay, but so what do I do? Well, by yourself, there are things you can do, but not much. It has to be a collective social project, and it has to come with justice. There is no point on degrowing if it doesn't come with justice, if it doesn't come with a political project, so to speak. And the idea is to change the paradigm, because of course there is nothing worse than, not growing in an economy that is based on growth. That is what is happening in Spain. Of course, it's going to produce more unemployment, but do we want to go on the same path and continue with the same self-destructive growing paradigm, or do we want to change the paradigm? Because the truth is, and this is what Yayo Herrero and other people from Ecologistas en Acción say, is that we are before a dilemma. The oil is going to be exhausted. Natural gas, there's only so much we can go on natural gas. So we have limited resources, so it's physically and from a material point of view, it's impossible to continue on this path. The question is, do we want to degrow with justice, or do we want to degrow with eco-fascism? So far we're into the eco-fascist path, but we can discuss that. And for instance, reducir, this is from Yayo Herrero, who is the chair of Ecologistas en Acción. Reducir, and the translation is behind. Reducir la esfera material de la economía no es una opción. Los propios límites del planeta, agotamiento de recursos no renovables, saturación de sumideros, disminución de los suelos fértiles, alteración de los ciclos y las dinámicas de regulación, etc., van a obligar a ello. La reacomodación a una esfera material más pequeña puede hacerse mediante criterios ecofascistas, es decir, una parte cada vez más pequeña despilfarra y sobreconsume energía, suelo, agua, pesca o materiales, mientras que la cantidad de excluidos ambientales es cada vez mayor. El decrecimiento justo hace referencia a un proceso planificado de redistribución y reparto de lo que proporciona la naturaleza, a la vez que este proceso se construye de forma coherente a los límites físicos de la biosfera. You only have to think about times. The time of regeneration of any ecosystem is very slow, and our economies are very fast extracting materials that the best way to put it is minerals don't grow up like potatoes. Once you extract them, that's it, right? Another objection, I'm advancing some of the potential objections you might have to this, is okay, well, but not everybody should degrow in the same way, right? We're not all responsible in the same manner from this kind of like consumption and extraction of like limited resources. That's true. It's true that it's mostly countries in the Western, Northern Hemisphere that are sort of like extracting and consuming more resources than they should. Just to give you an idea, if we were all consuming at the rhythm of the Basque Country, we will need 3 planets. If we were all, there is a website that calculates all of this. I'm not just making this up. If we were all having cars and like buying things the way we do in the United States, we will need 10 planets. That's why, that explains why we cannot all be middle class and rich. The resources are limited. So somebody's going to get water and everybody else is going to die because they don't have clean water, right? And usually the people who die are in Latin America, Africa, those places. So yes, not everybody should degrow in the same manner. I think it's the countries of the north, first and foremost, because, how did that happen? Okay, my PowerPoint is off. Well, I'll go on without the PowerPoint. Sorry. So, there is a correlation, between the financial debt, and here's the moment where I start speaking about Latin America more directly. If you look at the arc that goes between the Bretton Woods agreements after World War II and the Nixon shock, the moment in which Nixon decided to separate the dollar from the gold pattern, that's the moment where like the IMF, the World Bank start to overflow Latin American countries and countries in other places of the third world with money, right? Cheap money, and this is the moment of the debt, financial debt. So you have financial debt that goes hand in hand. It's like sort of like they are el hacia el en vez, right? How do you say that in English? The two sides of the same coin: financial debt and ecological debt, right? Both of them go together, right? So in what way can we talk about an ecological debt from the north towards the south? In at least four ways. Carbon pollution, we drive more cars. Tourism is north-south. We're burning more fuel than anybody else. Biopiracy, Monsanto, does it sound familiar? They're just taking over, seeds, ancestral knowledges, and they're saying this is ours. They're creating patterns with them. We're stealing all kinds of things from the south to the north and saying it's ours. Environmental passives, pasivos medioambientales. By that I mean depletion of like fish banks, for instance, or forests. The way we are able to eat a burger in every fast food corner in this country is by deforesting, Latin America, for instance, a lot of forest in Latin America. So and then toxic dumping. We use our cell phones and then throw them into Africa or Latin America. The best way to exemplify that is referring to our friend, quote unquote, Larry Summers, former Harvard president. This is the guy who said there are no women in the sciences because they are biologically incapable of doing that. He's an economic advisor. He was an economic advisor of Clinton, and he's now or was an economic advisor of Obama. And he said, he has a memo that was leaked in which he said, I see absolutely no problem dumping toxic waste in third world countries because their life expectancy is so short that they won't be old enough to have cancer and be cured. They will die before. So it's totally, from an economic externalities, from an economic point of view, it makes complete sense to dump all of this toxic into them because they will die before anyway. So we have this. It's clear that to me that degrowth is a materialist. There's a lot of talk about decolonization, and it usually has to do with cultural imaginaries and all that, and I agree with that. I think it's interesting. But if Mignolo et al. Want to be really serious about decolonization, they have to take into account degrowth, because without attacking the material base that allow us to live the way we do, extracting resources, labor, and like stealing things everywhere in Latin America, there can be no decolonization. So, and now I'm going to show you, and I finish right away so that we can discuss, what would be an eco-critical practice of all of this that is just theoretical, economics, all of that. I went back to El Zorro de Arriba and El Zorro de Abajo from José María Arguedas. I'm coming to call you, Gareth. Because if you don't know this novel, you should, and you should read it. You know, it was the last, posthumous novel of Arguedas, The Fox from Below and The Fox from Above, right? He killed himself before he was able to finish. He wrote it at a moment of like intense personal and I think national crisis. And it's a novel that went unnoticed until I think the late 90s, early 2000, when, around the debates of subaltern studies and all that, it became clear that it was a meditation on limits. And limits is the key word for any kind of ecological critique. And sort of like a novel about globalization in Latin America that was published like before its time, and it was not really understood when it came out. And for instance, Gareth Williams, he gave me the paper one day that I was running around it. And I read it, but I didn't understand anything. I reread it now, and I probably don't understand it either, but I understand it better. But Gareth said something like this: El zorro de arriba y el zorro de abajo is perhaps the first novel in Latin America to strive to grapple with the socio-economic and cultural realities of what we call globalization. It is therefore a narrative of transition between one mode of production and another, a point of impending historical rupture in which passage from a national to global forms is experienced as both destruction, ongoing primitive accumulation, expropriation, separation, and necessary, yet apparently impossible, redemption. End of quote. So, following this scheme, like Williams reads El Loco Moncada and other characters of the novel, such as Orfa, a cajamarquina prostitute, and as, I don't know how to say this word in English, inassimilable figures that suspend capitalist forms of hegemony and social organization in Peru. The novel points to a limit of capitalist biopolitical operations, a moment of suspension in which Zoe's biological life cannot be reduced to bios, life as the objective of politics and governmentability. This is following Gareth's argument. From a slightly different position, Alberto Moreira reads Los Zorros as a meditation on the end of magic realism, transculturation, criollismo, ethnographical fiction, cultural heterogeneity, a la Cornejo Polar, and the very possibility of signifying and writing. As he elaborates further, the suicide of Arguedas should be interpreted as an essential element of the novel. The two bullets symbolize a limit in Arguedas' writing project and an opening of the lettered city to its very conditions of possibility. In his own words, and I quote from Alberto Moreira's, in Suicide, Arguedas comes to an end of writing. By coming to an end of writing, Arguedas takes writing to its very end, there where it reveals itself as an instrument of signification, precisely because it loses the power to signify. End of quote. Building upon the reading of Williams and Moreira's, I want to interpret the novel from a slightly different perspective. More concretely, I want to suggest that the degree zero of the narration in Los Zorros is ecological destruction as a byproduct of economic dependence in the south and exponential growth in the north. In a letter to a Spanish editor, and this is a long quote, but I think it's worth reading it, he explains how he came to have this project, Arguedas does. And he writes this letter to, I'm going to read the letter to Carlos Barral explaining the project. This is the translation, I'll read it in Spanish. Hace 2 años empecé a escribir una novela sobre el tema de los pescadores de anchoveta y la verdadera revolución que ha causado en la costa peruana la industria de la harina de pescado. Yo solía pasar el verano en un puerto semiabandonado que está a 170 kilómetros de Lima. Se llama Supe. Fui allí por primera vez en 1943. No existía en el puerto un solo bote a motor. Había sido un importante puerto de embarque de azúcar, pero la gran hacienda San Nicolás, que está a pocos kilómetros del puerto, quebró después de la Primera Guerra Mundial y vendió su refinería como fierro viejo al Japón. Desde entonces, Supe se convirtió en una caleta de pescadores de corvina y de embarque de guano. Tenía una maravillosa playa y cuando llegué ya solían pasar el verano en este lugar algunas pocas familias de la clase media-baja. Alquilé una casa bastante grande en 15 soles mensuales, 30 pesetas. No dejé pasar un solo verano hasta el año 1960 en que se instaló la 18ª fábrica de harina de pescado y convirtió al puerto en un inmenso surtidor de humo pestilente y la playa en un fango cargado de gusanos nunca vistos. Ya en ese año una sola habitación sin luz y con piso de barro costaba 400 soles.
Fui testigo de la transformación del puerto y de sus gentes, de cómo esta silenciosa y paradisíaca caleta se convirtió en una especie de urbe entremezclada de negros, cholos, indios monolingües quechuas, chinos injertos, prostitutas, ladrones y de empresarios sin entrañas. Varios omnibuses venían de Lima los sábados cargados de rameras y se volvían los lunes cargados de oro. El mecanismo o los métodos inventados para que esta gente informe que constituyen los pescadores permanezca siempre pobre, a pesar de los increíbles ingresos que obtienen con la pesca, es algo superior a las posibilidades de ficción del novelista. So, end of quote. José María Arguedas was able to observe in Supe and Chimbote that Peru was crossing a dangerous threshold that compromised both human and not human life. And it was also this very material limit what brought his writing into crisis mode. How to capture this world in which every possible limit has been surpassed seems to be the driving force behind the life and death writing enterprise of Los Zorros. So it's also very important that he is focusing on the fish industry, because there was a boom in Peru, like from the years that he said, late 60s, early 70s, and the fishing industry replaced, it's an extractive industry, and it replaced guano. And what both guano and fish oil and fish flour had in common is that, they are extracted to be sent to the north. Guano to produce fertilizers, and the fish, the anchovies to produce fish oil and fish flour. And both of them, within 7 to 8 years, they were, so basically you're extracting a natural resource to be shipped back into the northern economies, right? And extractivist economies like these are a race to the bottom. If you read Martinez Alier, the reason why it's very difficult to create a bourgeoisie like in the north is because there's no way to make enough money to sustain it for too much time. It's basically you extract it right away, send it up, and then it collapses. And that is exactly what happens. So it's like these two forms of dependency together. So the novel is composed of several elements. Oral history, this is very important. He conducted like more than 3,000 interviews, or other people helping to conduct these interviews with fishermen, with people. He said something like, I don't even have the need to invent a lot of character because I'm just based it on it. Then Bracci, one of the characters, is based on the real figure of like Luis Banchero Rossi, who was, he owned like an industrial fishing complex, has a lot of boats, and he was killed in very strange circumstances. There are like, it's still one of these things that is a mystery, but some of the, like what he says in the novel, like has to do with, they're like direct quotes from like this sort of Capitán de Industria, it's very masculine, very like gender in that way. Then his diaries, and then the third thing, and this is what I want to focus on, and I'll finish in like 5 minutes, is that okay? Are you not sleeping now? I'll tell you another story. And then the third thing is or the fourth thing, is a rewriting of a text that he translated. It's a foundational text of Quechua culture called Dioses y Hombres de Huarochirí. And that's, it's a mythological story about the zorros, the foxes, the fox from above and the fox from below. And it's the struggle, and I don't understand enough. I'm trying to understand more, like what is at stake in this text. But one of the things is the struggle between the coast and the sierra, which in Peru is very important. And the other thing is the struggle between water and fire. And apparently these two foxes had this encounter 200 years, and now they're going to have another encounter. And the next encounter takes place on chapter 3. This is when the fox from above, which is more Quechua speaking, used to be with the sierras, it represents water, comes into the factory, in one of the oil, fish, and flour factories. So you have Don Diego, which is the fox from above, and Don Angel, the fox from below. And Don Angel, which represents the industries, explaining, what is at stake in all of this. And so he's describing Chimbote, this town, in the following manner, and you have the quotes behind in the translations. Chimbote de noche somos nosotros, las fábricas de harina de pescado y aceite. Yo me carcajeo del humo rosado de la fundición que a usted lo impresiona. De noche estas máquinas, nuestros muelles, tragan anchoveta y defecan oro. Eso es vida, ¿no? And he described the industry as two worms that are like going into the ocean and sucking up, like life and transforming it into gold and extinguishing life and then producing toxic, right? So at night, esta es la traducción. Me asustó, this is Don Diego, the fox from above. El gusano parece que comiera aire en una sepultura vacía, right? I don't know if I... Yeah, and I think this is what I'm getting at. That is not just living labor of workers, but also life in general, both human and not human life, what this double machine of Chimbote is extinguishing and appropriating and destroying. Solo la vida, this is Don Diego, the fox from above. Solo la vida produce un brillo como este que está viendo mi ojo. Y en esta poca luz el mar nos manda su resplandor que nosotros apagamos y convertimos en otra vida. Pero la muerte es como ese gusano que está en el vacío del cemento. So, there is more quotes that I'm gonna just. One thing that I want to say is that these processes, must not be understood in gender and racial neutral terms, but rather within the reach of neo-colonial processes of gendering, sexualization, and racialization. Because woman and nature are considered externalities to the process of oil and floor fixed production, they can be treated as objects to increase profit. Women bodies like the earth and the oceans can be exploited or killed without repercussions. That is exactly what happens in Chimbote. Male worker exploitation in the fishing industry and the rise of a highly profitable sexual industry are two sides of the same productive process of neocolonial exploitation. Chimbote is a body without organs. Through its veins, the money flows from the fishing industry to the brothels, and from the brothels to the pockets of businessmen like Brachi or Panchero. Chimbote is a double machine that sucks up the life of workers, fishermen, and prostitutes alike, and the life of nature. And this process is not racial neutral. The prostitute that all the fishermen want to sleep with is a very white, blonde Argentinian. And I think there's a purpose to have this, that is to enforce certain racial hierarchies that are part of the same kind of machine. So, and the novel talks about two machines, the old one and the new one, and how one is over the other one. And there are many instances in which the workers are trying to strike, and then Brachi, this Capitan of Industria, overflows the town with prostitutes, and then they become depoliticized. That's the way they are controlled. So what is at stake, and this is where I'm kind of in dialogue with Gareth and Williams and Alberto Moreiras, but also extending kind of the analysis. So what is at stake in Los Torros is not only the end of transculturation, magic realism, letrado cultural, biopolitical governmentability, or modernity, but also the very death of humanity and nature in Peru. In other words, it is not only that the modes of interpretation enter into crisis, literary and cultural interpretation in the case of transculturation or heterogeneidad, but also political interpretation in the case of biopolitics. It is not just hermeneutics, but also the very materiality of life, both human and not human. The abyss that Arguedas contemplated is the abyss of cultural and material finitude, brought forward by ecological catastrophe. So I want to just end with a question, ever since Arguedas wrote about Chimbote, we have only seen the extension and multiplications of many more Chimbotes with this kind of death drive to appropriate both human and not human life. And yet, in The Economist of the North, we continue to ignore that we are working. I don't want to sound apocalyptic, but the planet is limited. We are extracting all of these resources from the southern economies, and yet, we continue to behave in the same way. So I don't know. The question is how can we address, this kind of urgent question? Thank you so much.
So, open to questions, comments.
Hey.
Hi, Elise. Welcome back.
Thank you.
I wonder if you could say something about the place of the human in your analysis. So, you start with that really interesting quote from Marx about humanism, and then you are talking about human and animal life under economic systems, under biopolitics. And yet, you have also put up some interesting citations that make worms and machines in opposition to human suffering. And this is a really big question because that's the way it is in my mind. But I'm kind of interested in what gets to occupy the place of the human in the analysis, and whether that matters. And how that matters in relation to different kinds of non-human?
Yes, yes, no, it makes sense, and it's one of the flows, but I will respond, or try to. Marx said something very interesting in the manuscript, which is that man is a species being, that it is within the animal realm that is different because he or she has consciousness, right? So he both places humans within nature, but at the same time distinguish them from animals. And I think I would agree with that when you see biopolitical operations, I think they're capturing not only like living labor, but also all of this other like living life that is just, it's the drill baby drill model, right? Like nature is mine, it's ours, we can do whatever the hell we want with it, we can extract the oil, we can deplete the fish banks and, commodify everything, and because we are somehow superior. I think Marxists sort of, and then on the other, you have a lot of people doing eco-criticism that are sort of saying, well, human and not human life is the same, right? Like it should be sacred in the same way. I haven't fully fleshed that argument, but I don't agree with that term. When people start to use, the metaphor of the concentration camp to describe slaughterhouses, I think we're taking an epistemological jump that I'm not sure I'm willing to take. But what I see clearly is that the extensive power of biopolitical capitalism it takes both human and not human life within its apparatus of accumulation. I don't know if I have responded. But the question, I need to read Derrida, like the frontier between, I understand that the frontier between animal and human is more tenuous than we have pretended, but I'm not sure that both things can be conflated, and I'm kind of more in agreement with Marx saying that man is a species being. It is an animal, but it's a different animal because it's capable of a certain self-reflexivity. He's taking that from Feuerbach's. But I have to do, I know that, I'm saying this thing about appropriating like life, not just workers' life, not just living as a way of provoking, but it needs to be theorized further. So thanks for the question. I don't know.
I think that would be interesting because you are talking about sardines. I mean, you're talking about.
It was, when you go give a talk, they usually ask you things you're not prepared, you're, oh, really? But this is something that I would have anticipated, that somebody would have asked, so thank you. And I have to do more thinking. Guys?
I have a question about time. Your whole presentation was predicated on the idea that the planet has its limitations, that we have limited resources, which indicates then that we're dealing mainly with a kind of spatial imaginary, to an extent. So I'd like to kind of see if there's another way of thinking about the same problem, or thinking of the problem from another angle, which would be the angle of what kind of language we can use to think about degrowth.
Right.
Because clearly, the language of damage, depletion, disaster, labour, commodification, value and price, that is all the language that pertains to what Benjamin called the empty, homogeneous time of capital. So the choice for me is, do we reproduce that, or do we try to think of a temporality that doesn't reproduce that, which is clearly part of your project. So my question for you would be, following the kind of Benjaminian note, would be, does degrowth have a concept of history?
That's very good.
That's part one of the question.
All right, well, I'll try. Yes, I think, if you look, it's very interesting because one of the things that the eco-feminists they do is to say, look, the time of capitalism is fast-paced, right? It's accelerated. It's that homogeneous, empty time of modernity, and what is the new time? The new time is this, right? You click here, if it's not there immediately, you're there's a notion of accelerated, almost instantaneous time, right? So the notion of time and therefore of history that I think we can articulate from an eco-conscious perspective is a notion of even of arrested time. A notion of arrested time that is more aware
of the temporality of nature. You know, an ecosystem takes time to regenerate, right? The time of the homogeneous empty time of capitalism is this accelerated time. So the temporality of the growth, I would say, is a temporality that is slowing down, and kind of like there's this idea of adjusting to the rhythms of ecosystems and the biosphere. And in that regard, I think is you know, like a time outside the time of progress, accumulation, and capitalism. More concretely, it's very interesting. What they propose is to go back, when people talk about this, like, oh, but what are you proposing? To go back to the caveman and all that? No, actually the 1960s, like the rates of consumption of the 1960s will be within, you know, what is possible in a limited planet. But I think, to think about your question, for me it's important to not think about time and history as something disconnected from space and the materiality of life. Any kind of theoretization of time needs to be consistent with the materiality of life, and that will take you away from the accelerated empty time of capitalist accumulation. You know what I mean? That's what comes to mind.
Following with that, I think it's extremely interesting, both your approach and both and Garrett's reply. How about the other issue also of time, bringing the asymmetries of time, where there is not only just the time of the you know, the expectations or horizons of expectation, but also the issues of falling back to this past. I'm thinking of an ancient past. Think of Chimbote, it's there, but it's, again, you go back to a millenarian tradition, all of a sudden you're put in a different universe. So that follows very well with the notions of what happens, for example, with peoples in the Amazonian basin. Think of the Pygmies, think of all that. They're moving towards this, that's modernity, but at the same time they're looking for the Loma Santa. They're looking for that. So both things address this movement. So in the sense that I would address also these asymmetries of time.
Between Global South and North. Yeah, if you go, Fede is not here, but he was telling me that he was in Misiones. You're immediately within another temporality. What modernity does, of course, is linking that temporality to the time of progress, accumulation, and a way of life that doesn't recognize any temporal, physical, material, or spatial limits, you know. And that's why it is very difficult to discuss, to even pronounce the growth, because it's like, what are you talking about, you know? So I mean, again, I need to think more, but I of course, you know, like, different temporalities in different modes of production or, you know, ecological system have repercussions. The question is how to unlink them from that kind of accelerated time of modernity, Gustavo.
Well, you know, I wasn't going to say anything, but now that we're talking about temporalities and different temporalities in Latin America, which is, it is something I would prefer not to hear. I mean, it's like, this is something that has been said about indigenous peoples since the beginning of anthropology and archaeology. I'd rather talk about rhythms of these people's modes of production, because the temporality is something we assign to them. This is something, a very typical move, you know, this allocation of time we perform when we assign these people a temporality that is not contemporary to them. So I don't know what you think about this, talking about the different rhythms that modes of production impose on life, and not necessarily different temporalities, because the temporality assumes, and this, I'm not saying you or Javier are thinking in these terms, but maybe you're a little bit unaware of being spoken by some traditions a little bit. You know, for instance, when you say these different temporalities that coexist in the present, we're somehow approaching the issue from a neo-evolutionary perspective, even without knowing, because, you know, it means that there are different temporalities in the history of the species, and it's always something in a very Hegelian narrative that comes from the least complex to the most complex. And I would say that I don't want to talk about that because of the risk of being interpreted. I'm not saying that you are saying. I'm talking about the risk of being spoken by that tradition.
And I'm also not inclined.
Yeah, I know.
Look, I'm from Beja.
But that's a different thing.
So that's why you bet, and here is why I'm saying that, because I talked about degrow, which is a body, a theory, like Latouche called it, like a political slogan with theoretical implications. So I'm speaking from here. I didn't mean to delete my positionality as a subject. Now, that doesn't mean that I won't listen to, the indigenous movement in Bolivia saying, that I don't know if you know this. This is a very interesting, and I like to talk to you, Javier, about this. But basically, like the government of Morales and Linera, they want to build this highway that will go through the Tipnis, which is a natural park that is the territory of, I don't exactly know what ethnic.
The territory there in Beni.
Right, and they need to get the road there because there is natural resources there and everything, And they don't, from what I understand, they don't want to go through Santa Cruz because that's the stronghold of the oligarchy. But it's an extractivist project, and you have half of the indigenous movement in Bolivia saying, we don't want that.
That's right.
The oil on the land, like we just don't want you to build this road. It's going to talk about temporality. It's going to absolutely destroy the fabric of these communities and so on and so forth. I'm a Western man, I speak from where I speak, but of course that doesn't mean that we shouldn't pay attention, careful attention about the way in which, indigenous people talk about the relationship to nature, the economy, and and all of these things. But you have to depart from when you have to depart. And certainly, if my notion of temporality, which I didn't brought up because it's untheorized, I agree in the presentation, is reproducing this kind of superiority, then is or unintendedly, yes. Then we, I'm certainly willing to be open-minded and agree, but I think I just don't feel confident passing. I grew up in Bejar, not in the Tipnis Park, so I will listen to it and I will be as humble as I can, to understand my own prejudices. But that's the only way we can have an interesting dialogue between the growth, which is originated in the north, and Wembivid in the south. But I cannot go native because I think there's nothing more racist than going native. And I'm not saying you're saying that. But if we are reproducing Hegelian, time, then I think both, the three of us, I'm sure, are happy to. There is a question in the back, and then I don't know the order. I apologize.
Go ahead. Please, come on. No.
I was just gonna say, I don't know how much you've looked into theories of conservation or commenting or stuff like that, but there's a guy, Leinbach, and he does Marxist kind of economy history based on, it's called the Magna Carta Manifesto, and it's more of a popular book, but it's about manifestations or when people evoke the Magna Carta or commenting throughout legal history in efforts to protect the rights of subsistence and maybe degrowth, and it could be really, he has some Latin American examples of that, and so he talks about Marx and Magna Carta and the right to still gather wood, etc., and the distinction between Magna Carta and other, but carrying all through to the contemporary age. And then conservation, when if indigenous groups use conservationism, the racist sort of implications or the roots of that, and then nation forming or boundaries or limits in a different kind of discussion, and how that plays with trying to degrow, or can it be contradictory?
So repeat what it is that he's trying to do. I'm sorry.
So that conservationism is a different think, a different line of thought. The other guy is trying to talk about when commenting, protecting the commons or having access to the commons is evoked by different groups in law, in different constitutions, sort of throughout history. He sort of starts with the Magna Carta as his base.
The Magna Carta is what exactly?
The Magna Carta, the English document, which is sort of we'll compare it to our Constitution, Declaration of Independence, but in the medieval document, where they kind of the enclosure, he compares it to when an enclosure starts to happen, but there's this protection to say certain protections to be able to still collect wood, to have a common area, common grazing rights, slippers, etc. And so, and he includes women's work and women's role in getting, and their job is getting the wood.
It's mainly happening in Great Britain, like he's trying to do that where?
Great Britain, but then he takes the book and he moves it to the United States, to Latin America, examples from all around the world.
Right, okay. And how would that play with the grow?
As in when groups try to think of collective, where there are collective, I don't know, manifestations in different movements that are against capitalism and protect subsistence living as opposed to sort of the time of capital, of development, of I don't know, monocropping.
Right. Yeah. I think it's complicated, right? Because a lot of, if you do that, there is a tendency, especially here, like to, okay, I'm just going to go to this territory and I'm going to cultivate the land there and like everything is going to be, this seems like more complicated because it's fighting for the commons. Mm-hmm. But what degrowth does in a very effective way is linking overconsumption in certain areas with the extraction of resources. Because if you protect, there's a lot of people protecting for the commons or a national park and all that, but if it's within... So what I'm trying to say is that how do we sort of struggle with the structural, the need to address the structural and initiatives that are trying already to degrowth? And I think it's possible to create commons, to create patterns of harvesting and cultivation that are already... See, in other words, we don't have to wait until we have full degrowth to start living within our physical and material limits. I don't know if this is where
I think it would kind of actually go along with that.
Yeah, and it's like, as you can tell, I came with my plastic bottle and I was really reluctant to do this. I was like, whatever, me having a plastic, and then I started going to teach my degrowth class and the students were like, that seems like very incoherent, but of course, like doing this, we all have these things that, of course, who knows where they are like produced. But so I think, and your example is different, the defense of the commons, and so there are several, like Ecologistas en Acción, they have their own like collective common, huertas where they cultivate and then, everything is, more reasonable, I guess, for lack of a better word, where like labor operates in a different way. They have a true, how do they call it? Libre mercado verdaderamente libre, like a true free market where like there's no exchange of any, you can take anything and eat anything you want. So there are all of these experiences and I think they are very useful and I wouldn't discard them. But, I think, again, what I think makes degrow, it makes, a lot of the things that the degrow people say have been said before. I don't claim, I don't think they claim any originality, but it just makes people that don't think about the environment to think about the environment in relation to what they do. Not just as something that happens far away or, it's just, it forces you to think things like, as much as you have efficient, the technological solutions, you can have an efficient laundry machine or an efficient, butter, but if you keep building mansions or golf courses, we can have the commons, we can have these things, but it's never enough. So I think, I don't know if I could say this kind of quote.
Okay, Brian, I have a
I just wanted to...
Somebody, sorry, give me a Coke or something else.
Regular or diet?
Give me a diet,
So Brian, recyclable.
I just wanted to give you a chance to talk a little bit more about the political imaginary behind your project. And I'll just give you, there are just kind of 2 points to kind of work against. One, I was interested that you started off with kind of critique of like individual consumerist politics, that I'm going to not, I'll recycle, I'll do all these individual actions. And then you ended with degrowth, which still feels like a politics that's more or less around consumption, although on a slightly larger scale. And then there was another moment in your talk where you very briefly, as a kind of aside, gestured to people who don't have, let's say, they don't have access to certain kinds of products, or they don't have access to certain kinds of means of production. And there was a kind of moment where it seemed like you were maybe verging on starting to talk about problems having to do with uneven development or with the need for modernization or something like that. And I just was curious, does the growth need a politics around production and not just a politics of consumption?
It's all about a politics of production. It means reducing the sphere of production to make it fit with the material limits of the biosphere. And it's not a politics of consumption. And they say things like that. They say things like, consumption is untenable. Therefore, one of the, there is, I can read you the list of points. It has a program. Like if you, I know you're not asking exactly that, but it says something like, marketing and publicity should be prohibited. Because, they don't advertise needs. They create false desires. Right? Like potatoes, eggs, milk, you don't need to advertise needs, basic needs. You advertise unnecessary, things that are really, do you need that Gucci bag or this PlayStation? No, And it has a very strong critique of what they call program of obsolescence. If you haven't seen Comprar, Usar, Tirar, it's on Televisión Española, why, they build things in a way that it breaks down. Remember, those of us who are from Spain, we know that we have a TV, our parents bought a TV and it lasted 20 years. Now they don't last, I was telling this morning the students, like, if you don't have a flat screen TV, you're a perro flauta or, some kind of gentuza, that. So there is this, it's all about reducing drastically consumption. It's all about, they have concrete ideas that go with this theoretical body. One is prohibiting marketing and advertisement campaigns. Where are we going to find the political will to do it? I don't know. Another one is like flying. Flying is untenable. It's ridiculous how hard it is today here in Ann Arbor. And we're all seeing it. It's in front of us. It's so in front of us that we don't see it. So one of the proposals they have is actually a credit card with which you have the right to travel once a year, and that's it. And once you have consumed your miles, you just stay in your place and don't go anywhere. Another one is reducing the amount of people that live in big cities. Like, big cities are like ecological dead machines, all these mansiones in San Diego, they are untenable. How do we prohibit them from keep building those mansions? That I don't know, but clearly people should go back to live in rural areas. I know this is complicated, but if we are really serious about degrowing, all of these things need to happen. Then taxing, we have a lot of instruments to tax pollution that we don't use, like it should be penalized. And that's why all of these agreements that in the Oslo summit and in other places, like always the United States is in other countries, but especially the United States. So it is about producing without, producing is about producing in a way that is more conscious and respectful of nature laws. For instance, the law of entropy. No economists, they don't take the law of entropy seriously. That means that when you burn, a solid fuel, there's no going back. The second law of entropy means that when you burn a fuel, it disappears and it never goes back to the original state. It's lost forever, and it won't last forever, right? And so it's all about going down to produce, within those material limits, and within a consciousness of the fact that when you destroy a forest, it just doesn't come back in like 2,000 years or more, So we need to produce in a different way. We need to produce, for instance, another thing that they wanna, the problem is this. As you see, it's every time I start talking, every time somebody asks this and I start explaining, I was telling them, I feel like a cura en un burdel. Because you're telling people, oh, don't do this, don't do that, And I haven't found a way to talk about it, go back to produce in this way and that way, or that, and it's very difficult. Now, the problem we have, I think people that are into the degrowth movement are all about production. The question is this, as in this novel from Belén Gopegui, El Padre de Blancanieves, is that we can decide anything but what to produce. How many so-called Western democracies are able to decide how many bread are going to produce, how many computers are they going to produce. None. We have no say whatsoever over what we produce and how do we produce it. But there's this list of things, you know, that you can do to actually be more aware of like what is, you know, materialmente posible. Then it's all about uneven development, of course. It's all about uneven development. And I'm not to tell, again, I'm not going to go tell the government of Hugo Chavez, stop being an extractivist economy, you know, like you should be within the limits of the planet, you know. It's for them to believe. I think capitalist development is a callejón sin salida. But, you know, I think it's not for us to tell anybody what to do, right? I mean, I wish, and I think this is the debate today in Bolivia, in Ecuador, you know, how to produce, because you need to create wealth so that people eat, and at the same time do it within a way that is not emulating the worst, you know, of Western capitalist development.
It seems to me that your project is based in a notion of justice, and at the same time it's looking for a notion of, or a practice of justice. Could you tell us about that? I mean, how do you conceptualize justice in terms of eco-criticism and is, for example, el zorro de arriba, el zorro de abajo offers any kind of justice? Or
yes, to the extent that el zorro de arriba and el zorro de abajo points to, you know, I think it's shown by negating what happened in Chimbote. You know, if you become an extractivist economy based on, you know, overfishing the anchovy and exporting those calories to the north so that we can have like food supplements, and you do it without any awareness of the fact that if you do that, then there's no anchovy, which is actually what happens right now, to the extent that it describes, you know, the crossing of all of these limits, you know, I think that novel is a no, you know, to that model of development in the name of a yes that needs to be constructed collectively. So it's shown by negation, by negating a kind of dependent neocolonial capitalism that benefits a tiny elite in a country and destroys both human and not human life. It's pointing out to a horizon, you know, of ecological justice that it has to be different. Now, I believe that any project of justice have to count with different trajectories and different people articulating this project. You know, I said what the Grow movement proposes, but it's not what I proposed. And I think it's something, what we need to open is a space to discuss, you know, what the possibilities of justice are and who can participate in it. We need to, in the case of Bolivia, all the social actors, in the case of Spain, all the social actors. Of course, culture has a very important role to play because it has a memory of certain things that has happened, and it shows, you know, a different literary imagination as traces, as pistas, you know, of where things could go, you know, and in that regard, I think the novel is a meditation on limits, in every possible limit, and those limits were crossed. So the lesson is like how to, you know, use that to create, you know, how to say no to that Peru, you know, of Chimbote that has been only growing in the name of something else that needs to be constructed collectively and from different points, and of which the Grow is just a name that I think opens possibilities and opens a space to debate things that we don't want to debate.
I was wondering if you are planning to address debt in your project. You mentioned it in the Latin American context after the abandonment of the gold standard by Nixon. But the way global capitalism in recent years depends absolutely upon debt, and debt is premised on this assumption of continual growth that will erode, diminish the debt over time. And in Spain, you hear a lot of talk of the debtocracy and figurative money, that this debt is largely figurative, it's fictional money. And then that is also an area where economics and theology intersect, because Christianity is one of the great debtor religions. You know, he paid for our sins, and we owe this unpayable debt.
Yeah, I tried to explain how we saw financial debt. That's very clear how like the debt in Argentina and Ecuador, how it was acquired and when and all that. But I think it's sort of like financial debt is a disciplining apparatus, right? Because if you have to pay, I mean, I think there is a clear consciousness in Western capitalist democracies of the fact that we depend on the extraction of all kinds of resources, labor, seeds, patents, all kinds of things from the South. And, you know, that in order for that to happen, people won't give it up for free. But if they are in debt, if they need to pay back that debt, then, you know, would they think about pollution or whether like an economy based on a housing bubble is viable in the long term, you know? So financial debt is what guarantees that on their own, countries in places like Latin America or Spain, where La Ley del Suelo was like a free check, you know, to build things on the coast and pollute and, you know, all of that. And financial debt is the conditions of possibility for ecofascism. I cannot put it better.
Yeah, indentured servitude.
Yeah.
Peonage again. Yeah.
I mean, the plan for Greece right now is to actually, they are telling the state to withdraw from some of the islands and privatize them. And of course, when you privatize them, are there going to be any restrictions? One thing that neither Obama nor Romney wanted to talk about is the new Trans-Pacific free trade agreement with China, Korea, you know, all of these countries. And it has, the environmental part of the treaty is basically a free check to do whatever they want in terms of polluting, dumping, you know. So we do these three things: carbon emissions, biopiracy, and there is actually, Luis, I don't know if I'm forgetting his name, but he has a really good paper, and there is a website that tracks down, you know, how much ecological debt we have incurred in the north. See, what he said is very interesting. We don't want reparations, right? Because once you start, okay, you know, like I think countries in the north could say, okay, we owe you that much, and then you settle it. What they want to say by talking about ecological debt is to show the asymmetries. The fact that, you know, not everybody has contributed to global warming in the same way. So I think you're right that once you enter into the circuit of debt, you know, there are these metaphysics. But I think it's good to use strategically ecological debt against financial debt to show, you know, that the relationship between one and the other, because I think they are absolutely related. Like when people say, well, you know, yes, you do have everything to do with this. You know, you can drive this car because we have this ecological debt. For instance, nowadays we go and like put like the good fuel in your car, right? The ethanol based and all that. But it's all, you know, based on a neo-plantation economy in places like Honduras. They gave the coup d'etat so that they could cultivate African palm that goes directly into the production of ethanol, right? And that's the kind, you know, you don't want to see the relationship between one and the other. And I think when you talk about ecological debt side by side to financial debt, you're pointing out to how the circuit of extraction and debt works, you know. But it needs to be fleshed out further, I think.
And is there any other questions after Jaime and Lucía, and then Gabriel, and then I invite you to
Ya no sé lo que estoy diciendo.
for the reception, and then after this we'll go to have some couple of beers to another brewery, and you are invited to come. Jaime.
Please, I want to go back to Ryan's question about political practice or activity. When you compare yourself to a priest, and when you say degrowth says this and that, like you were saying, it sounds like the nomenclatura got together and they're going to come out with a 5-year plan. And I'm sure that's not what it is. So Christina asked you, what's the new kind of justice that comes out of this project or this new activity that's going on? And so I'm not asking you to imagine or improvise a new concept of common practice, which you said was essential. But to say, what is it that's going on right now in this movement that changes the way that we think about collective practice?
I mean, we are so behind. Like, the reason I said this thing about the priest is not because I have any preachy inclinations. It's because I think consumerism is hooked up to desire. No, I don't. I mean, desire is linked to consumption. So the first question that I ask everybody, and I ask myself every day, are you willing to live with less?
But that's an individual.
No, collectively. It's not my option, because even if this is why I don't believe in consumer activism, because I don't buy what I want, I buy what I can, like everybody else. I mean, if it's up to me, I would say that reproductive labor should be compensated economically, that I am the product of all of this labor of care that was done for free. If I said that I am completely impotent to decide what can we produce and how can we produce it. But the first thing that I see, really, everywhere, is selfishness and a complete, disregard for the way in which driving cars, the way we do in California, is predicated on extolling, on a neo-colonial project of extolling the resources and the lives of people, both here and abroad, but especially abroad. I mean, if that doesn't create some kind of indignation,
it does.
Then I don't know. But look, I was listening to NPR, and they were like, there was a typical case of how this is framed. 70% of the water that we consume in San Diego comes from somewhere else. It's imported. And they were like, oh, how can we? And immediately the first question is, how can we continue growing? Building more houses, and at the same time guaranteeing that we are all going to have water. And so they were like, well, you can put a new, very efficient laundry machine, and those of you who have these lawns and all that, you can don't overwater the plants, And at no point, there was any discussion of actually reducing the amount of water that we use. At no point, or saying we should stop building golf courses. Why? Because that water comes from the Colorado River. It goes to Las Vegas, then it goes to LA, some of it goes to San Diego, and then what happened with the Cuyamaca Lake, which is inhabited by the Cupaya indigenous people, that they cannot fish because there is no water there. And then you go to Tijuana, and the first thing you see is that everything is dirty. Why? Because it's being polluted in the north. So the first thing is to be aware of that, asymmetry, and that more is not always more TVs, more cars, more bigger houses is not always better. That it comes with a price. That it comes with crossing thresholds from which we cannot come back. I don't see anything preachy about that. I see consciousness. And one of the things, the title of the book of Yayo Herrero is Cambiar de gafas para mirar al mundo. So I think our lenses here are making us blind. We really don't see. I was telling you when I'm telling you that there's no going back. Look how hard it is. Some things will not come back. We kind of hear that, and yeah, but I'm gonna go home and just turn on the TV, buy this, buy that. I don't know. So it's not. I mean, these people are actually the eco-communists. At least the ones that I know in Spain are probably the more open, democratic.
That's what I'm saying. What are they? What is their practice like? Other than
they do everything from being in the 15M, trying to really push Spain to have really renewable energies, not like gas or anything like that. From the true free market to protecting spaces like that, to actually they've done an amazing job, explaining to people what is reproductive labor and why it is not price, it's outside, it's an externality. Capitalism is very funny. Everything that is not in this interest of profit, of the profit-making machine, is an externality. Oh, we are sorry. Because we cannot subject this to the mechanism of prices, whatever. Women should work twice as much, both at home and abroad, and they shouldn't be paid for that. Because as we all know, human beings, we are pathetic. We need 18 years of somebody taking care of us. Who does that in a society? Mostly women, because they're maternal. Well, they did a very good job pointing out to all of these things. From these to very specific things, like why tampons and compresas have a luxury tax when they should be cosas de primera necesidad. And it has nothing to do with nomenclaturas or anything like that. It has
if we all fly the way we do, then we're fucked. What can I tell you? You know, like this thing is gonna be more warmer and warmer and warmer and warmer. And of course, you can say I have AC, you know, and what the connection, you know, the connection between like el Cuerno de África. Ay, qué pena, todos a dar un cheque porque se mueren de hambre. Well, no, we created it. It's an unnatural disaster. It's like man-made. You know, we created it in California. What are we doing? Like driving each one person per car. That's crazy. And that's crazy. Why? Because the car industry needs to make profits. So what are we saying? That I'm saying that I'm against that. That is crazy. That public transportation should be developed. You know, that consumption should be reduced. And if it sounds like a preach, well, I'm a preach for the ecology.
Okay. Lucia.
Yeah.
I got excited.
Now you mentioned this purpose of putting together financial debt and ecological debt, and I was thinking, it made me think like how often in the last decades the government going back to Latin America have done exactly the opposite, no? In order to pay the debt, completely give away everything. Argentina. But my worry is now that we have had like 10 years of left governments who are obviously very far away from that early Marx that you were talking about, but still are calling themselves left parties. I was thinking about the potentiality of a political transformation within the political system, and how do you imagine that the whole concept of democracy or something that is not similar to democracy, but how do you see the possibility of negotiating in these Latin American countries which are governed by the left but actually have little space for this kind of thought? How do you think this?
I don't know. We need to keep talking, pushing, writing. You know, in the case of at least the Latin American governments are more open. You know, if we're talking about Bolivia, Ecuador, they are still into genetically modified seeds. You know, there's a huge fight in Argentina over that because I mean, Cristina is all about let's produce soja here, and you know, and I don't care what happened because she's producing a lot of it. Not Cristina. Like super car. But at the same time, you know, at least they're talking about, you know, it's, I wouldn't like to be, you know, Evo Morales, or not that I could anyway, but or Álvaro García Linera, you know, because you gotta feed people, right? And there are ways of producing food that are cheaper and faster, and they feed people, but at the same time they compromise, you know, the diachronic externality, right? You're compromising your land, you know, you're compromising your future in many ways. But a common thread that I see in Bolivia, Venezuela, Cuba is that they're talking more and more about food sovereignty. For one reason, because, you know, the price of food globally has tripled within the past, you know, 5 or 6 years because of oil prices. I mean, this thing that we all do, here is another example. Why are we eating tomatoes all year long? Tomatoes don't grow all year long. They are genetically modified or they're brought from abroad, right? But bringing food by land transportation is unsustainable, is long-term, very destructive, and it actually creates food shortages in a lot of countries, including the countries that I mentioned. So they are worried about food sovereignty, but they are, you know, here's where we are. They want food sovereignty, they want to be independent, right? They don't want to be so dependent on like global food prices, but they haven't figured out completely if they want to do it the degrowth way or Latin American hardcore capitalism, you know. And I think they go back and forth. Most of the time they're very extractivist, but I think at least there is an opening to talk about it. Whereas here, in Spain, they celebrate that, like, construction is back. They're like, great, you know, we're back into building houses. What is that? You know, that was the very thing that created our problem in the first place. But of course, the economy grows, it creates I understand people, they want a job, right? And they want a job right now. And so buying into these modes of destructive production can be faster, right? So I don't know what to tell you. I'm not very optimistic, depending on the day. But I think at least they're talking about food sovereignty, and that way, you know, I think we have an entrance into talking to them about not, you know, basing their economy on extracting resources without taking into account the effect that it has. Also, I don't think we can hold to, usually one thing we do with Cuba all the time is like, we're like, my God, you know, you're so authoritarian, this, that, you know, we say all of these things about Cuba that don't apply, that we do not apply with the same, you know, force to our own capitalist economies here. So I'm not saying that I'm in favor of like doing that, but I'm saying that we shouldn't have a double standard. That, you know, that I think it's immoral to say there is a political prisoner in Cuba when we have a prison industrial complex that incarcerates thousands of people of color every year, and nobody says anything, you know, about that. And when like there is police brutality here, it's just an event that happens to happen here, and que pena. But if it happens in Cuba, you know, that doesn't mean that I support anything like that or repression in any way. What I mean is that there is a double standard, and I think it applies to these kind of issues too. But we need to keep, you know, telling them this. You know, I don't know how successful we will be.
Okay.
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 On the one, you're talking about resources, I see, but then you're using the term nature a lot in your discussion of resources.
Mm-hmm.
I'm just wondering how that term works in your thinking about degrowth. Like degrowth looks like being more natural, or like going to nature, or like returning to nature. Like I see this,
tension.
This tension here, and I'm just wondering how it works.
I don't mean nature in any Rousseauian way of going back naked, you know, like anything like that. I mean it in the sense that you know, that resources and the biosphere, and that we, in the way Marx used it, that without the sun, if the sun goes off tomorrow, we are really doomed. You know, there's nothing we can do without that energy. There's very little we can do without water. There's nothing we can do without oil in our current economic paradigm. And those natural resources, you know, the capitalist thinking is like, it's mine, it's a commodity, and I'm gonna price it. What is the solution for like water problems? What is the capitalist solution? Great, you know, it's a commodity, it should be priced according to the market, and those who don't have the money, they should die out of thirst. What I'm talking about decommodifying to the extent that is possible in nature. I'm talking about criticizing the paradigm that there are two paradigms in capitalist society, at least two, there are probably more, but there are two that I hear often. One is the drill, baby, drill model. This is mine, who cares, you know, I'm just gonna go to Alaska, I drill it, it's mine, I take it out, it's ours, you know, we have the right to do it, I don't care that there is no more oil in the future, that like some of these ecosystems are not returning, I don't care. And then there is gonna be a technological solution down the line, and we can resolve everything creating a green economy, right? And the hybrid cars and all that. I think neither one of those are actually taken into account. I'm talking about something like taking into account the second law of entropy. There's this guy, Georgescu Rogan, that wrote this entire economical treaty about how economies refuse to recognize that when you burn oil, the oil doesn't come back to being oil. It's lost forever, and therefore we're going to have to rely in another kind of, you know, energy. So there is nothing romantic. I'm not interested in anything like that. I'm talking about, you know, nature as a very material source of energy, resources, and that we have to live within those limits. And if you look at, this is what I think Marx, and when this is all in, if you read Vandana Shiva, I think she explains this like so much better than I do. But when you're saying that the land, you know, that the land is the mother, you know, and that it cannot be raped like that, actually that kind of cultural imaginary is bringing you closer to living with what it is possible, physically possible, for the resources that we have in that way. And she talks about the demothering of land, which is a very interesting way of like kind of coming back about I mean, you detect a tension that is true, that, I mean, we have said this thing, modern nature, like feminism of certain kind wanted to run away from that, and actually Vandana Shiva and other so-called third world feminists are actually reclaiming that, and I think they are using it to very fruitful and
and creative possibilities that explain to us that there is another way of living that is not this one.
Okay. Thank you very much. And then we will